been doing the last couple of years as far as it relates to weed management for vegetables. Particularly at this stop, I'm going to kind of focus more on commercial processing vegetables. We do have another field day coming up next week. Next week. You know what day it is? Thursday. You already heard about it, right? Okay. So anyways, that's why I'm going to focus more on some of the processing vegetable and our work in that area. Before I get started, I want to mention Barb Scott, who's standing over here. Barb has been working with me for a number of years and is just does a great job of putting the plots in and keeping everything on track and collecting the data and working with the students that we have. We've got a great crew this year. There's Joseph, Colleen.
Colleen's with the
She's with the other one. Okay. Colleen and then Nick is not here. So a great group of students to work with as well. So with that, I'm going to talk about some of the programs we have for weed management, some of the research programs that we have. One area I've been quite involved with in the last few years is the USDA IR4 program. Now, the IR4 program is funded through the USDA, designed to help register pesticides for specialty crops. So it's not just weed control, but insecticides and fungicides as well. We have looked at a lot of this work is very preliminary. It's products that may have a fit, may not. They just need some more data, particularly on crop safety, and that's where we come in, looking at crop safety, whether the crops are going to tolerate it or not. The next step is, okay, if it does tolerate it well, is there going to be a residue issue? And that part of the research gets done someplace else. We're primarily looking at crop safety. And just to kind of give you an idea, over the last 3 or 4 years, we've looked at potential herbicides for sweet potatoes, watermelon, tomatoes, peppers, squash, pickling cucumbers, beans, and sweet corn. So you see, it's a pretty broad list. A lot of things, we may have a study this year on it, but it may be 4 or 5 years before it sees the light of day. But it's an important program, particularly for those specialty crops growers in the state. One of the projects that we were involved with 4 or 5 years ago was looking at glufosinate, which is the active ingredient in Liberty or in Rely. And it recently got a label with the support of the IR4 program for use in a number of vegetables as a row middle application. It has a label now for cantaloupes, cucumbers, summer squash, watermelons, tomatoes, and bell peppers. So a fairly broad range of crops. This is a shielded, glufosinate is a very broad spectrum herbicide, injures a number of plants. So if you spray it over the top of any of those crops, you're going to essentially kill them. So this is for like a shielded or directed application between the row middles. In the case of watermelons or cantaloupes like we've got here with our hooded sprayers, be one way of applying that. The label for that should be, well, hopefully by next year it'll be more readily available. BASF did not make it very available this past year, so I'm not sure how much practical experience people got with it, but it should be much more available next year in case you're looking for alternatives to, say, paraquat and those type of applications. Another product label that we got out of the IR4 program that was labeled 2 or 3 years ago was the use of dual magnum over the top of lima beans to help provide some extended residual control. One of the problems we have with our lima beans is that we limit it in the herbicides that we can use post-emergence over the top of the crop. So as the crop gets some size to it, weeds start breaking through, and we don't have a lot of good options. So one of them is this concept of overlapping residuals or extended residuals, of using a residual herbicide, in this case dual, 2 to 3 weeks after the lima beans have been planted to extend that residual control. Dual won't control any of the weeds that are already up, but it could provide an additional 2 to 3 weeks of residual control, which will help keep that crop clean till it starts to canopy over. One product that was recently registered that we looked at out here is a product from Syngenta called Optogen. Optogen is it's a group 27 herbicide. It's an HPPD inhibiting herbicides. It's used in corn. It's used in small grains. This is the first label they've had for vegetables. The label, it's currently labeled for broccoli and strawberries as row middle or directed application. It's also labeled for sweet potatoes and watermelons as a pre-transplant application, and then or as a directed application. We were hoping that BiPAC or the Optogen would help provide some control with our morning glories and with our pigweed species, particularly in our watermelon crop. Unfortunately, it was not very effective on either one of these species. It was quite safe as a pre-emergence application, spraying it under the beds before we transplanted. We didn't see any injury out of it, but we also didn't see any appreciable weed control when it came to those two species. We still need a little bit more work on which species it is going to provide us some residual control. Maybe we move into something like strawberries, where we have a whole different complex of weeds, more winter annual weeds. We may pick up some problem weeds there. But as far as helping us out for morning glory and the pigweed species, it was not the product we were hoping it to be. Another area of research that we've been doing the last couple of years is herbicide carryover. As you know, almost all of our herbicide labels have precautions on the number of months between application and when you can plant specific crops. And for a lot of our vegetable herbicide, for a lot of our corn and soybean herbicides, that time frame is 12 to 18 months, which essentially means you can't use it before you plant some of our specialty crops. A lot of that is done out of precaution by the manufacturer. They're just overly concerned about crop safety, and to be honest, a lot of specialty crops are a relatively minor part of their business, so they don't invest a lot of money into those type of trials. We've got some funding from IR4 as well as from the Delaware Department of Ag to look at some of these corn and soybean herbicides and see if they will be safe if we use them the year before planting a lot of our vegetables. If it comes to fruition that they are going to be safe, it will give us a wider range of herbicides that we can use in corn and soybeans and still rotate to vegetables. That's going to help us with our overall weed control. It's going to help us with our resistance management, because we can incorporate new or different modes of action than we often do. Because what typically happens is, because of these rotations, we're locked into using the same herbicides that we normally would use in watermelons. If we're going to plant watermelons next year, we're often using the same herbicides this year in our corn and soybeans before we rotate to watermelons. We don't have that diverse herbicide rotation that we would like to have. So hopefully with this research, we can identify some candidates and be able to reduce those rotational restrictions and be able to use a broader range of herbicides previous year of vegetables. The last trial I wanted to talk about was a pea trial that we did for 2 or 3 years. It was funded by the Delaware Department of Ag, their specialty crops research initiative, looking at fall cover crops for peas. And in theory, it should work for other early season vegetables as well. But peas, because of the way that they're grown, particularly the way that they're harvested, we need a relatively smooth field at planting time. And so we're relying a lot on spring tillage for that. But if we get a wet spring, it can delay the time between when we can till and when we plant. So our idea was to look at fall tillage, and then immediately after fall tillage, plant a small grain cover crop. So then coming into the spring, we don't need to work the ground. We spray our cover crop out, plant our peas, and gain additional working days. Particularly in a year like this year where we had a lot of rain early in the spring, that no-till cover crop plots could support the weight much sooner than if our spring tillage. And although we weren't able to document this, we were going to be able to gain additional work days in the spring with that cover crop. So we were looking at fall tillage, either moldboard plow or chisel plow. We're immediately planting small grains. In this case, we were looking at rye, and then spraying out our rye 3 to 4 weeks before planting peas. We have some of the issues with an early pea crop of trying to kill that cover crop sometimes, which sometimes the weather is not ideal for herbicide performance. But one of the advantages of using a cover crop like a grass cover crop, we can always come in with an additional herbicide like a group 1 type herbicide that's very safe for broadleaf crops, and put a second application on to kill that grass. We looked at, not only were we looking at work days that we were able to get out of, we were also measuring some soil health characteristics of it, and one of them was active carbon in those plots that had cover crops, and we were finding more biological activity in the spring in those cover crop plots versus where we weren't using cover crops or where we were doing spring tillage. So as an option, it really seems to be a nice fit for us. One of the things we were trying to measure, being a weed science program, we were trying to see if that cover crop would, and because of lack of spring tillage, if it would reduce our weed densities. And we did not see that as a benefit. Our weed populations were similar whether we tilled or not. But as far as improving the work days that we had, water infiltration, the cover crop was a big help in that regard. 2 minutes. All right. I'm going to leave it at that, because if I go any longer, if I say anything else, I'm going to go too long. But I'll open up any questions. Anybody have any questions for us? Yes?
Do you think your weed control with the rye, because rye is so small? I mean, we use it in pumpkins all the time anymore. It seems to be the hottest thing out there because it's so much mulch. But it's this tall when you put it.
Exactly. So it's not that the rye doesn't, it was because of the way we were killing it early. Barb, do you remember what day we were spraying that on? It was like mid-March. Yeah, it was about mid-March. So, I mean, we had 3 or 4 inches of growth. So we didn't expect that the rye itself would help suppress weeds. We thought maybe the fact that we weren't going to be tilling in the spring, we wouldn't stimulate that flush of weeds. But in this particular year, that didn't seem to matter. But rye and cover crops, rye and pumpkins, I mean, we're letting it grow another 6-8 weeks, getting a lot more biomass, and it certainly is helping us with weed control there.
Spring oats provide more biomass for coverage? They planted in the fall?
You know, a lot of our spring, we used rye. I don't think it would provide any more biomass. Rye is probably, we find to be biggest producer of biomass. Rye also, because of its growth habit, you know, as shortly after it gets out of the ground, it tends to stool right away. So we get better ground coverage more with rye than oats or wheat or barley. The other thing would be that you know, you're relying on, the spring oats are going to winter kill. So yeah, you may not need to spray in the spring. But then we were looking for at least a little bit root growth in the spring to help with infiltration. So, not saying it wouldn't work, it just wasn't the species we chose. All right.